Well, how are you finding your visit to the United States? You haven't been here in
Well,
years.
I don't know. I'm still getting used to being as disabled as this.
Yeah, that's hard, I know.
Yeah, up to a few years ago, I mean, the leg was bad shape, but I get about. So
It's an
there is a
injury.
There's a deterioration, and the pain feature is
Yeah,
very discouraging.
that's too bad.
There isn't much they can do about this pain. The analgesics they give don't work. And so I keep telling him they amputate the damn leg. It's so good anyway. But they think I'm joking. And then I say, well, I don't mind becoming a morphine addict. How about giving me 25 milligrams of morphine 3 times a day? That would be fun. They think I'm joking. I'm not joking. I'd be happy to be a morphine addict. Alcohol is not enough. I could become an alcoholic, but it's not going to work. I've tried. I mean,
Is that the result of an accident?
yeah, it was an automobile accident a long time ago.
God, really?
And for many years, I could compensate. The leg was injured and the hip broken and so. But for many years, I could compensate well enough to get around
Yes.
and walk and go on tours and so. But for the last few years, it just deteriorates. I mean, you know, age piles up and it has its effect.
Yeah, some things don't work quite as well as these.
It just has its effect. It's nice to smile, and I tell myself jokes so I can laugh. I do that on buses sometimes with people turning around and look at this crazy old man laughing to himself. And they're not far off.
It's better than cussing to yourself or
That's right.
crying.
I tell myself jokes.
All right, it's,
Well,
And the beautiful thing is you haven't given up.
yeah, well, I tell you, if you really let it get you, you might as well blow your brains out. So you work at it. That's about what it amounts to. You work at it, and yeah, I do tell myself jokes. That's the truth. I don't know enough jokes, so I run out of supply, and then I can't tell her because she's heard them a million times. And but I get so I talk to people in the street more. I'm likely to talk to almost anyone. I don't know why that's true. I talk to bus drivers and old men and children, and little kids go running by me, and I look at them jealous. I look at them running by, and I think, oh, wow. It's just one of those things.
when you went to Israel, were you teaching there? I can't remember.
Yeah, well, I had retired.
Yes, okay.
But when I got there, they were very nice to me. Partly because some of the guys on the faculty in psychology were old Columbia PhDs.
Oh, really?
And they were so scared. So when I passed them in the hall, they would duck. And so they've been very nice. They gave me an office and telephone. Every now and then they'll ask me to teach a course. Mostly because well, I'm not a budget line threat. You know, I'm not going to take over a line in the budget. I'm a part-timer.
You're not going to compete with them.
Yeah, I'm not competing with anyone. And no one's tenure is threatened. And they can get me pretty cheap. I don't mind. I told them that. Although they have to pay me something. Because when I got to Israel, I discovered that in Israel, if you volunteer, say to pick oranges and grapefruit, it all sounds patriotic. The Israelis have no respect for you. The first question is, are they paying you? So I insisted on being paid, even if it were 1 shekel a year, like $1 a year, ma'am. So when somebody says they're paying you, I have to be honest and say, yeah, they're paying me. Don't tell them how much.
Well, what university is that? Is that the
Hebrew University, the big one.
big one? Yes.
And they are like most psych departments. They're very similar. There's a strong Freudian
Yes, sir.
theme. And they're practically all of them clinicians. The experimentalists, there are none, really. There are some who got their degrees in experimental back in the States. But a laboratory is very expensive, and the Israelis don't have the money for it. So that if clinical is relatively easy. You know, it's all talk. And psychotherapy is mostly verbal anyway, it's just people talking to one another. And the students come along and grow up and they all want to become psychotherapists.
Well, I suppose it's a way to almost immediate income. They can hang
Yeah,
out their
that's right.
shingle.
You put up a shingle and you can make a living maybe. And they can't put me down on that because I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I'm
Yes.
licensed in New York State, and when I got one of the early licenses, so nobody could say, "Oh, you're just an experimentalist, you don't know the stuff," and so on. But it ain't true. At least it ain't true on paper. So they've been very nice, and they like all universities, they like seeing their name in print.
Sure.
And if I publish a paper or two, which I'll be doing, you put down the university and they like it. And this little book will have it also. But they have been very nice, and I don't mind. And sometimes they have a course they can't cover. Someone's been gone on sabbatical. And so they'll say to me, "Can you cover this?" Well, usually I can't, but they won't accept that, so I go in and I try to cover it for somebody. Like the history of psychology. I'm not a historian. But they had a course in history, and there were, about a month and a half of that course was on the history of behavioral science, not Freud and the French psychiatric school. They were handling that. So for about a month and a half, I talked about the history of behavioral science. So they find that useful. I mean, it's of some use to them. And their students never hear this sort of thing. And even when they hear lectures on things, you know how professors are. They can only tell students what they learned when they were students. And a lot of it is bad. It's just bad stuff. So the kids are like kids everywhere. They goof off in the same way. So that in class I'm likely to say to them, "Can't you think of a new way to goof off? You sound just like the students back in the States."
A challenge.
Yeah, you know, students are students. And they're always, it's an interesting country. The Mormons have recently had a series of seminars.
Oh, really?
There's one of the psychologists in Utah, Brigham Young, an American, is a Mormon. I didn't know that. I don't know what religions these people are, but they told me that. And he was coming on a visit, so the Mormons were arranging a colloquium or whatever. So they asked me to go. I don't know anything about it. I mean, I've read the usual thing, Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormons. But the Mormons had put up a big center. Now they have a very strong proselytizing religion.
Yes.
I don't know how much you know about them, but their young people go out for a year or two in the field, and they're nice young people. I've talked to them. They're polite and well behaved and so on and so on. And for a long time, they wanted to put up a center in Jerusalem, and there was resistance by the other religions that didn't want another competitor. But eventually, they got permission to put up a center, and I didn't know anything about it, so I went. It's magnificent. I don't know how many millions of dollars that place cost. So much I asked. I said, "Where do you get all this money?" You know, it must be 8 stories high and elevators inside. Beautiful.
Angel at the top, boys and
Oh, it's just terrific. I mean,
They built some beautiful, beautiful temples.
oh, beautiful. Well, the answer to where they get the money, they tithe.
10%.
They tithe their
Down the
people,
line.
and their people deliver. Well, if you went to the little synagogue in Jerusalem that I go to, the whole place is about as big as this room, and they have trouble getting enough money to have the place swept. I mean, but the Mormons, and so the colloquium went, and I got to know the director of the place. And two of my students wanted to do a term paper. Well, I had no objections. That seemed perfectly okay. The director of the institute wasn't going to have any of that. And I told my students, you got to understand, he thinks of it as a threat. You're going to interview the students, a lot of questions about their faith and so on. Why don't you go to the director and ask him to help you set up a questionnaire, which he will think of as a threat? Well, they did, and finally he did help them, and they did write a paper and so on. So it's that kind of a town.
Is there any representation of behavior analysis in the,
No, well,
in the
not
country,
really.
in the whole country? In the
Not
place?
really.
Mhm.
There's some guy, I have my offices down on the low floor, and there's a lab, a rat vivarium somewhere around the corner. I know, I can smell them. But no one's ever, in 10 years, no one ever told me what they're doing with them. Maybe not doing anything with them. I don't really know.
Do you think it would be an academic and intellectual climate where behavior analysis might be
Well,
welcome?
I've asked,
Mhm.
but there's not much of a reply to it, whereas if you ask about clinical.
Yeah.
I read something somewhere about one of these, was it Anna Freud or somebody, who developed the notion of the unconscious fantasy. So I read that, and I didn't know what it meant. I have fantasies, but they're conscious, so I can enjoy them. What good is an unconscious fantasy? So I asked the students in the class, I said, have you ever heard of it? They never heard of it, even though they're clinical students. So I said, look, don't tell your teachers that I've asked you, but see if you can find out for me, what is an unconscious fantasy? Ask your teacher somewhere in the lecture hall. I never got any feedback. They either didn't ask or they did ask and never got an answer or whatever, but that's the kind of stuff. Now, I still don't know what an unconscious fantasy is.
I don't either.
Does it make any sense? It doesn't seem to make any sense.
So it's not very worthwhile, as you say.
I mean, I want to enjoy my fantasies. I don't want to have an unconscious. It's an unconscious fantasy.
Do you think psychology is a science?
Well, not the way it's usually handled. Put it another way. Forget the word psychology. Is there a chance for behavior science to exist? The answer is yes. Now, it's a simple answer. I say yes. But you immediately get into the questions of what will the datum be? What does that mean? Every science studies something. If you're an astronomer, you study that. And if you're a geologist, you study that. As I tell students, you can identify a science by what it puts on its ordinate. Draws a graph. All sciences have the same x-axis. They're all physical variables of some kind. It's what they plot on the y-ordinate that tells you, is it astronomy or geology? And if they have a behavioral datum, then that's a behavior science. So the answer is yes. But a lot of the talk that psychologists go through is just utter nonsense. I mean, on the face of it, just utter nonsense. I don't have them here, but I cut things out of papers every now and then. The definition of cognitive psychology. Boy, you ought to read that. That is the dumbest thing.
Whose definition is it, do you know?
Well, it's somebody made a speech and put down, or they wrote, somebody wrote an article for the American Scientist about cognitive psychology and had some definition of what it was. It was just utter nonsense.
What was it? Do you remember anything about
Well,
it?
yeah, it was a science which relates your mental factoids to something or other. You know, I don't know what the hell it's all about. But you get into the definition, you're back to the mental this and that. Look, the president of APA 3 or 4 years ago was a gal, and she gave her presidential address. and it was published in the American Psychologist. So I read it. She said, quote, we'll get me to the quote in a minute. She was talking about modern behavior science, and she said, quote, who would have thought just a few years ago that the time would come when you could open a person's head and see the mind at work, close quote. There was a president of the APA, so I read this and I think, wow. Suppose someone had said to Descartes, you know, whoever would have thought that the time would come when you could open the head, find the pineal gland, and see the soul at work. What the hell would Descartes have said to that? I mean, and utterly shameless, without any idea what she was talking about. You can see the mind at work, even if there were a mind, you're not going to see it at work.
What was she referring to? You have any idea?
She made that one up. That was a part of her speech.
Okay.
Well, so the answer to the question is as much nonsense talked today as ever. But is there a possibility for behavior science? Yeah. You just have to keep things clear if you can. And you begin with a question, I think. I have to go to Mexico and make a speech. And it's a speech about Watson. This is the conference on Watson. Now, if I asked you or anybody, what about Watson's work was important? What did he really do? Well, he wrote the book on behaviorism and this and the other. Well, he did. What was it about? Now, I think, I'm no historian, so I may have this all wrong, but I think that what Watson was talking about and what got him into trouble, and still does, is he identified the datum, what it is that behavior science is about. Sounds simple. What is it about? You can have a science, it has to be about something. You can have a theory of behavior, it's got to be about something. You can have a theory about nothing. What is it about? So Watson took a shot at it. And he said, it's about the doings and the motions and the actions of the organism. Behaviorism defined a datum, what it is you were to look at. That it got into trouble then, and it's still in trouble today. That's what people are fighting it. Is the datum of cognition? Where the hell is that? Is the datum the mind? Where is that? We're back in the old arguments that go on ever since Aristotle. Well, I think, this is what I'm going to say in Mexico. I hope it's right. What Watson was talking about was not highfalutin theories of drive and emotion. He was talking about what the science was about. The doings and actions of an organism. And he had the nerve to include in that the verbal behavior of human beings. Among the actions that human beings go through, they talk. And that consists of movements, movements that are shaped and given meaning by the society around them, but they are behavior, just like any other behavior. He never lived that down. He still hasn't lived it down. The conference in Mexico is going to say a lot of things. I don't know what they're going to say, but I'm going to get up and say, it seems to me that Watson asked the question, what should science of behavior be about? Now they may kick me out or help me with cactus pears or whatever, but I think that's it. That's what got him into trouble, and that's what you hear about from professors who lecture on behaviorism, that we ignore the internal life and you ignore the cognitions and you ignore, and they give you this whole vocabulary. which may not represent anything.
Tell me, when Skinner and Keller and Schoenfeld, back in the very early days, started working on the subject matter of behavior and defining
Right.
it and so on, how was what you said different from what Watson was saying?
I think what I'm saying is what Watson said.
Okay?
And I think what I'm saying is what Skinner tried to say. Skinner was worried that that meant that you were going to be ignoring the private life of the individual. And he used private. These are private events and private this and private that. Well, what kind of private event is the mind? An event has to occur someplace. You can't have an event that's nothing. I don't think Skinner was behaviorist enough. And I don't think Watson would think that. He was worried, and Skinner was always worried about the reception that he would get from people. And he didn't like being rejected. He thought I was peculiar. Well, they thought of him as peculiar anyway, because of some of the things he did, like putting his girls into a box and raising them in the baby tender. And I keep telling people, there's nothing peculiar about that, it's perfectly natural. It's just think of it as a room. Wouldn't you be in favor of putting a child in a room that was air conditioned and had clean air and so on? Of course, but if it's big, you say okay. If it's little, you say no, he's treating him like a rat. He's not treating him. My trouble is that I think people say a lot of nonsense. And if I talk at all, I get into trouble. So the thing for me to do is just shut up and look professional.
Well, I think the thing for you to do is to talk.
It's very hard. Oh, if you know me, you know that's a tough one.
How did you get into behavior analysis in the first place?
Well, don't speak of behavior analysis.
Okay, well,
That got to be another
another problem, I understand. Well, whatever
Well,
field
the
you got
behavioral
into,
science.
behavioral science.
Mostly an accident. It wasn't because I was so smart. I just sort of wandered in and learned a few things and thought a few things. A lot of it was just accident.
Accidents at Columbia, was that where they?
Well, even my going to Columbia as a graduate student was an accident.
Really?
I didn't know anything. I came out of a city college and I hadn't learned anything. I thought I knew something, but it was wrong. I didn't. And I was one of the few, I was the only psych major who took a science degree. All the others were taking BSS, Bachelor of Social Science. I didn't like that. Not because I was smart, because I was just being self-indulgent. So I took a BS degree. I took physics and chemistry and geology and all the rest of it. And all of my friends, undergraduates and the undergraduate teachers, all thought I was slightly potty. What did I do that for? Well, I didn't know. I did it because I liked it.
Were you interested in science, in what they call the hard sciences before?
I don't know. I never even thought about it. I started out being a chem major. I thought I might be a chem major. And I took some advanced chemistry. It didn't persist very long as an interest. I don't know why. But I went on and took a BS, and then by a series of accidents, kind of stupid accidents on my part, I ended up at Columbia. And for the first time in my life, I found some men, professors, who knew something. I had never met anybody like that. Keller was not one of them, you see. He was just a plain instructor, a lecturer.
Who did you meet there?
Well, old Woodworth.
Robert Woodworth, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I had Woodworth's chair. When he retired, he gave me his chair.
Really?
It's a big armchair, very comfortable. And I don't know why he did that. Woodworth taught until he passed 90.
Yes.
But I had never met anybody like that. And I had never met anybody like John Volkman, who you probably don't even know. You know the name?
I think I do, yes, yes.
He was a Harvard man who had worked with Smitty Stevens in addition. I'd never met people like that. The instructors I had at City College turned out to be mostly bull throwers, as I discovered later. Including the great professor who was head of the department, used to lecture to us and took on the role of a Holtian, E.B. Holt. Now, you may know the name. Holt wrote a book called Animal Drive and the Learning Process. And this professor used to talk to us about that. And I never really understood it very well. I thought I must be feeble-minded. So I decided I'd read Holt. That was one of my troubles. I would go back and read the stuff. I read Holt, it turned out this guy didn't know what he was talking about either. Holt had never said that. Ah, well.
But what you mean is your professor didn't understand what
He
Holt was
didn't
saying.
understand what Holt was talking about.
Right, okay.
He had forgotten it, but it gave him a sort of pastiche or something. Anyhow, when I got to Columbia, I was just the practice of the department, of course I got into department finance, although a lot of that was excellent too. We took about 100 students a year for the MA. Of those, we matriculated, by we, I'm now jumping years, we matriculated approximately 10 for the doctorate. So there was one student in 10 would be touched to go on, which meant that the MA year was a highly tense time in the lives of students. Only 1 in 10 was going to be picked. That was a tough time. I happened to be one of the 10. I think maybe I know why, but I'm not sure. So there I was, and I had never even met Keller. Never took a course with him. Keller was very unimportant. He was going to be competing with Vulcan to see who was going to get a promotion to assistant professor after they had been there 7 or 8 years. I was taking courses with the important people. Keller was nothing. I never even took a course with him. Didn't know what he was doing. And as a matter of fact, I heard the name Skinner once in a lecture by C.J. Warden.
Oh, Carl Warden?
Oh, Carl Warden.
Comparative psychology.
He was a character.
So I've heard.
He was a character. He was an important comparative psychologist, but a very oddball. And once he included the name of Skinner in a lecture, he said, there's some guy up there who made a box and puts a rat in the box. And C.J. was working on mazes. The important thing was to standardize the maze so that every turn had the same degrees of turn as the other turn. It all turned out to be 120 degrees. And this guy put rat in a box, and the rat pressed something. Why did the rat do it? He was bored. There was nothing else to do in this damn box. That was the end. I never heard any more about Skinner from anybody until a couple of years went by. And then the circumstances, I read the behavior of voters and said that was a blow. I had never read anything like that. It was just overwhelming. Turns out now a lot of it was wrong, really. But that's the way science is. I mean, people who think of Skinner as God and never going to change, they're mistaken. Science doesn't stand still for anybody. And a lot of the stuff that Skinner talked about, looking back, is wrong. But at the time, when I read it, that was shattering. Because he was articulate, and he was smart, and he had invented an apparatus, and he had a measure, the rate measure, the whole works that finally I put into K&S was staggering. I never read anything like that. Well, that was a long time ago. Now there are still people who sound as if Skinner were Jesus. And a lot of it is, if you can't improve a science in 50 years, there's something wrong. one famous physicist said fairly recently, he said, no physicist today believes what he believed 10 years ago. Of course not. But psychologists sit around and they form these associations, and so I object to analysis. What the hell are they talking? It's as if this were going to go on forever. Well, if it does, it's unfortunate. We've learned something, I hope, in the last 50 years. And that doesn't detract from Skinner or his contributions. It just, you recognize that science grows. If it doesn't grow, you're dead.
How did you and Fred Keller come to collaborate in
Well,
so many ways?
that was mostly my doing. The war was on.
Mhm.
And I was classified as physically disabled because of a cardiac operation. And I didn't want to be that, so I appealed. My brother was drafted. And he was older than I was the youngest in the family. And my brother was put into an infantry division and eventually landed in Europe and saw rough action. And he was useful to the family. I mean, he was older and he had a job and he was making a living. I was nothing. So I appealed out of my deferred class so I could get drafted and have them turn my brother loose. The question was if there was one man in the family. So I actually got them to re-examine me and classify me. They continued to classify me as 4F. And there I was, and so the war was on. And all of us wanted to do something, contribute something. And the word got to me that this man Keller on the second floor, whom I didn't really know, or he was in the department, but I had never taken anything, was working on Morse code. So I thought, well, maybe I can be of some use. So I remember I walked down to his office one day and walked in and said, Dr. Keller, and you may know I'm one of those people around here. I understand you're working on Morse code. If I can be of any help, please count on me. And Fred, being what he was, Fred was a great recruiter. Mm-hmm. And so he said, yeah, and before I knew it, we were working on Morse code. Although it was really Fred's field, but if you get to work in an area, you eventually think of something to do. So the answer is, how did it happen? The war was on. It was really the war and my thought of maybe being of use to something, to somebody in the period of the war. And that was really it.
No, he does.
And then somewhere along the line, somewhere along the line, Fred said, you know, there's this book, The Behavior of Organisms by a guy named Skinner. Maybe you'd like to read it. Well, so I did. I took the book out of the library and I started to read it. And it was overwhelming. So I read it all through the night and the next day. And I finally, when I got back to Fred, I said, you know, as if he had me told, I said, you know, that's a great book. Oh, he said, really? It was that's the answer. How did it happen? It happened, the war was on. That's about why it happened.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Do you feel that they're training the psychologists of today different from the way that they train
No.
you, for instance, or is it the same?
If you're not a behaviorist, if you're not in this tradition, then it's the same old book as when I was a
It wasn't
student,
really there.
and 50 years before that, and 50 years before that. The difficulty in the field is that people don't know what the data is. Psychologists talk about anything. And they're not always talking about anything except the word. I mean, just to show you how difficult I can be and why I have to learn to shut up and look profound. One of the popular topics today is artificial intelligence.
Yes.
There is no such thing. Now, I know I sound like a troublemaker. Well, maybe. There is no such thing as intelligence. It's just a word used by people in certain connections. So you ask, what connections? And you can spell out the connections. Turns out it's just a word like ghost. They use that in certain connections too. Binet and Simon, who made the so-called intelligence test, didn't do that at all. Just go read them. They didn't make an intelligence test. It isn't true. But you wouldn't know that unless you go and read them. And then you discover that Binet and Simon were very practical men. You know what they were doing? Well, I'll tell you what they were doing. They were hired by the city of Paris and the Board of Education of Paris. They were hired to make a placement test. What the hell is that? Well, Madame so-and-so would bring her little boy, Jacques, to Paris, and they came from another city. The question, where in the school should you put little Jacques? What class does he go into? It's a common problem anywhere. So you bring a kid to Hot Springs from Texarkana, and you want to know what class should he go into. Binet and Simon made up a test to place little Jacques in a proper class. Okay? After they did that, a very fine practical purpose. That's excellent. Somebody decided that little Jacques, or what he knew, came because he was either very intelligent or not. That what a kid knew was a function of how intelligent he was. If he was intelligent, he'd know more. If he was not intelligent, he'd know less. The whole thing was just makeup. Somebody just said it. I mean, there's nothing there. But you can understand that kind of talk because all of us have been raised in a society which uses words in a certain way. And people who say that little Jacques learned depending upon his intelligence, so we all say, yeah, well, I guess that's right. Well, it's all right to talk like that, but you're not going to build a science. Intelligence testing, there isn't any such thing. You can have tests. What are you testing and what for? I'll tell you another thing. Even people don't teach this because they don't know it. And the professors don't go to the original sources either. They repeat what they were learning as students. See, you don't have an IQ, and you don't have one, and I don't have an IQ. You can't have an IQ. Why not? Because the IQ is a ratio. It's a ratio, and they tell you in class that's wrong. It's a ratio of a chronological age to a mental age. What the hell does that mean? Here, I'm giving you a lecture just to show you why you can get unpopular. Little Jacques, where are you going to put him? So Binet and Simon, who was his co-worker, decided that they would put Jacques in a class where he knew what the other kids knew. If he didn't know what the kids knew in this class, you'd have to put him in the lower one. If he knew all that the kids knew in this lower class, you'd move him up. It was a matter of placement.
Well,
so, Jacques was 10, let's say. And let's say that Jacques knew as much as the 10-year-olds by the test that Binet and Simon made up. And he knew as much as the 11-year-olds, and he knew about what the 12-year-olds knew. So you would say, and this is what they, not Binet and Simon, somebody came later. Jacques had a chronological age of 10, that was his age. But he had a mental age of 12. That's not true. He just knew what the 12-year-olds knew. That's the fact. You can call that a mental age, and somebody made a ratio of mental age to chronological age. You put 12 over 10, and you come out with 1.2, and you remove the decimal point by multiplying around it, so Jacques has an IQ of 120. What does that mean? It's a ratio of 2 chronological ages. There's no mental age in that ratio. It's 2 chronological ages. One is his own, and the other is a chronological age of kids that he matches.
So it's the sin of reification, I heard it called, the notion that just because you use the word intelligence, you think there is something called intelligence.
Trinity.
And personality is the same way.
Same way. A whole bunch of words are like that.
English is great at doing
They're great
that.
that way. There are
It's all
thousands of
Western
them,
European languages.
including cognition and private.
Yeah.
Skinner like private. You know, it's an event, a private event. An event, to be an event, has to happen someplace, sometime. You can't make it immaterial by calling it private. So, from the way I'm talking, you see, Skinner was not enough of a behaviorist. But anyhow, so now, why don't you have a chronological mental age? Because Binet and Simon and all of the others who work in this field since then, you know, I'll take my word for it, just read the literature. To be able to say that a 12-year-old knows more than an 11-year-old, you have to find questions or items that a 12-year-old can answer, and then an 11-year-old can't. And there is a progression. As the kids get older, they know more and more. But there's a limit. What is the limit? The limit is that if you try to find items, you try to extend this test to where you will have items that an 18-year-old can answer, but a 17-year-old can't, you can't find such items. 17-year-olds know about what 18-year-olds know. So in this ratio, what are you going to put down as a mental age? You can't differentiate anymore on the basis of knowledge acquired. The limit, then, some test constructors find the limit at 15, some at 18, so you just go to literature. Since nobody claims that a 25-year-old knows more than a 24-year-old, how can you assign an IQ?
Yeah.
Answer is you can't. So what did they do? What did this guy made?
Wexler?
Wexler.
Yeah,
What did Wexler do? I'll tell you what he did. And you go read the literature. He got a distribution of scores. He made up a test of items, just items of information. And he gave it to a lot of people, and you get a distribution of scores. Now suppose you take that test and you end up with a test score that's 1 standard deviation above the mean. Wexler would then say, well, if you were 10-year-old or 11-year-old, and you were 1 standard deviation above the mean, your IQ would have been such and such to bring you up 1 standard deviation. Since you are now an adult, but your score is 1 standard deviation up, we'll assign that IQ to you. Now the thing is wrong, but it was called in the early days, not anymore, now you have an IQ. It was called in the early days a virtual IQ. Go read the literature, and you will see that this bothered people in the field of testing. What are you going to call this number? It wasn't a real IQ. It wasn't a real IQ if there wasn't a mental age. And the mental age wasn't a real mental age anyway. It was a virtual IQ depending upon where in the distribution you fell. That's the Wexel. Now, what the hell do you do with it? You shut up and you look profound.
What do you know about this conference that's taking place in Mexico coming up?
Not very much. Emilio was organizing it. Do you know Emilio?
What's his last name?
Ribes, R-I-B-E-S.
Okay.
Emilio Ribes. Emilio is a great organizer. I mean, he just has this ability to get people to do things. And so he organized a conference a year or so ago and got the University of Guadalajara, which is a large university, to host the conference a year and a half or 2 years ago, which was an open scientific conference. Hundreds of people came. There were 4 or 5 days of presentations. It was a big operation. Emilio now had the notion, he asked me, and I said I thought it was okay to have a conference on Watson, because Watson's work, his great work, is now 75 or 80 years old.
I was trying to remember whether it was some
1913 was.
Yeah, right, okay.
So,
80 years, right.
yeah. So Emilio got the notion of having a conference on Watson. And he asked me, and I said, yeah, it seems to me okay. As long as you make sure that the people who are alive that give papers don't just all come down and say, oh, Watson was so wonderful, and so marvelous, and this and that. But you want some substantial historical contributions. Well, Emilio's enough of an operator to do that. So he got, I don't know who he got, but he's got a roster of people. It'll be 2 days. Each presentation is allotted 50 minutes. So if there are 5 a day, there'll be total 10, 15 a day. The audience is going to be limited to 75 invitees from the universities of Mexico. So it's a rather small and team little thing. But he's got enough funding for it to pay the way if people come down. And it's on J.B. Watson. And I'm supposed to go and say something. I don't know what to say, except that Watson, I think, was talking about the data. That's really it. All the rest of it is baloney.
What university is Emilio with? Is he University of Mexico?
University of Guadalajara.
He is Guadalajara.
It's Guadalajara University, and they have a center that they call, it's got a long, elaborate center. The Center for Studies and Investigations in Psychology. And they may have their own funding, I don't really know. But it's a center, and it's in Guadalajara. It's connected or is owned by the university. And the university has a press, and they would like to get the translation of the book and put it out. Well, I have an objection. I don't know Spanish, so I can't check on the adequacy of the translation. Some translations get pretty bad and some can be very good. I'm not going to judge that. But that's, his name is Emilio Ribes.
I think
And-
I've seen his name here, and I'm not,
And
I
he's
don't
at the
know.
Center for Studies and Investigations in Psychology.